Hello, Roanoke. Welcome to T-Bone's Best of Roanoke show, where we go after the best people, places, and things to do in our fair city. Big thanks to our studio band and my special guest host, Mr. G. Woo! Now, on with the show.
She's Beth Macy, best-selling author of Factory Man, True Vine, and her new book, Dopesick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America. Thank you for meeting with G and I here at On the Rise Bakery in Grandin Village, Beth.
Didn't have to walk far from my house to get here.
Well, listen, we really want to pick your brain about your new book. And one of the things that jumped to my mind right away when I was listening to it on Audible was this quote from Dr. Rogers, a doctor in Richmond. And if you'd be so kind to read the quote, and then we'll discuss it a little bit.
Sure. So he's writing in the Richmond Daily Dispatch, January 25th, 1884, and it's a letter to the editor. At the time, Virginia was considering making it compulsory that in order to get an opioid, you have to have a doctor's prescription. Believe it or not, at the time, you could just go to the drugstore and buy it over the counter. So it got voted down as class legislation, and this physician wrote this letter to the editor. He said, "This evil is confined to no class or occupation. It numbers among its victims some of the best women and men of all classes. Prompt action is then demanded lest our land should become stupefied by the direful effects of narcotics and thus disease physically, mentally, and morally, the love of liberty swallowed up by the love of opium, whilst the masses of our people would become fit subjects for a despot."
And the date?
1884, letter to the editor.
1884, Dr. G. Rogers. And Beth, how likely is it that a doctor in Lee County or Roanoke or Woodstock, Virginia could say the same thing if you just touch up the lingo today?
Absolutely. Yeah, they wouldn't say whilst, would they? But
134 years later, they'd say the same thing.
Yeah, well, think about Dr. Art Van Zee in Lee County in 2000, writing to Purdue Pharma's medical director saying, "I fear that these distressed communities that are full of overdoses and Oxycontin-related crime are sentinel areas, just the way New York and San Francisco were in the early years of HIV." And no one listened to him.
Now, what year was that?
That was 2000.
2000. Now,
4 years after Oxycontin came out.
Exactly. It came out in 96, Purdue Pharma, and it was introduced, but it was introduced in a little bit different way. Typically, when I think of an epidemic or something spreading, I think of from the inside out, from an urban to suburban to rural.
Right.
But this was the opposite.
Right.
Rural to suburban.
Right.
And so on. Is that right?
That's exactly right. It was different from the crack and the cocaine epidemics. And the reason it was different, the reason it began in distressed rural communities, not just Appalachia, but Machias, Maine, where there were loggers and fishermen and other places where a lot of extractive industries and lots of pain, workplace injuries. Purdue Pharma hired an army of sales reps to go out and to promote that this was an almost less than 1% addictive drug. And what they did is they targeted physicians who were already prescribing a lot of opioids, but they were much stronger opioids that they were competing against, like Percocet, Vicodin. They were much lower strength, And so if a community had a lot of doctors prescribing lower strength opioids, which were immediate release, a rep from Purdue Pharma was then sent out to hit that doctor up with the pitch that, okay, this lasts 12 hours, it will give patients the miracle of uninterrupted sleep, and and it'll bleed out over 12 hours. And they actually got the FDA to sign off on this squishy claim that said that time release mechanism was believed to reduce chances for abuse and addiction. And of course now we know it was exactly the opposite, because right away people figured out an end run, and they figured out if they put the pills in their mouth, sucked it for a little bit, the coating would come off, and then would then wipe the color off on their sleeve. People were walking around with orange and green stains on their shirts from the 40 and the 80 milligram. And the tragedy of this is there were people who were legitimately injured and had been on these shorter dose, immediate release drugs like Vicodin and Percocet, and then had gotten off them okay. Even recreationally, people taking a Percocet on the weekends could still function during the week, right? But the difference with OxyContin is it turned some people into monsters. They lost their whole family. They lost their farm. I mean, we're talking like a 75-year-old miner who had been injured many times before, but when OxyContin came along, he simply couldn't get off the drug.
Right, and Dopesick refers to the withdrawal, the fear of withdrawal from the high you would get from that. Is that right?
That's right. So that's what users call it. They say, I'm Dopesick. That means withdrawal, and that means when they haven't had it in their system in several hours, they start to get shaky, diarrhea, vomiting, sweats. They all say it's like the worst flu times 100. And really, at the end of their journey, they're not going after more heroin or more oxy to get high. They're doing it to avoid being dope sick.
Right. So they'll do anything: prostitution, steal stuff, sell stuff, fake injury to get more prescriptions.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, there have been murders committed in the coalfields. This is years ago. A grocery store manager making a night deposit. That's how desperate people get.
One of the heroes, and you mentioned him, was Dr. Art Vandy.
Vanzy. Yeah.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about him, because he was right there at the ground zero, it sounded like, right?
Right. So he was the first doctor to really sound the alarm in the nation. He's writing them letters as early as 2000 with the Sentinel areas comment. He's begging them to take it off the market until it can be made to be abuse resistant, which they did, but not until 2010. And some people believe only because the patent was about to expire. And, he was seeing things like being called out in the middle of the night to the hospital where a child he had immunized as a baby had just overdosed as a teenager now. And all of his, most of his caseloads, he said he had 2 or 3 people that he treated before OxyContin came out for addiction, and then his caseload became overtaken by OxyContin-related addiction.
And they made it, Purdue Pharma, they do not come across very well in this narrative. Are they still in business?
They're still in business. They've made $35 billion off the drug. They're owned by this one family that's given lots of money to museums and the Smithsonian and have wings named after them. And they were fined in 2007 right here in Western Virginia for criminally misbranding the drug for the first 5 years.
Right?
Abingdon, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
But none of that money went to treatment. And it was just really a drop in the bucket compared to $35 billion. They paid $634.5 million. And it all went to law enforcement and things like setting up PMPs or prescription monitoring programs.
Well, it's easy to look back on it now, Beth, but do you think, knowing what we know, what the FDA did and what Purdue did, this could have been avoided?
I do think it could have been avoided. If you look at Dr. Benzi's early letters, they're very measured. He's respectfully asking them to take it off the market until it can be made abuse resistant. And there was a model for that. There had been a drug out several years earlier called Talwin, and the same thing happened. I believe that was a morphine based drug. I might be wrong on that. It's in the book. But anyways, the makers of this other opioid that they quickly realized people were abusing and diverting, they took it back off the market immediately once they got complaints, and then, got their scientists to work and reformulated it to be abuse resistant and then reintroduced it. So it could have been done. The company just didn't want to do it. And the other big thing they did was they capitalized on the pain as a fifth vital sign movement that was happening, kind of growing out of the hospice movement and pain being undertreated, and they really took advantage of that.
Rank your pain from 1 to 10.
Right, which of course is very subjective.
Right.
And people learn what to say when they went to the doctor.
So
especially in these distressed areas where people didn't have jobs and they realized they could sell it and make thousands of dollars. They could sell their pills.
Yeah, exactly. So what was behind the push outside of the extended pain relief, going from a few hours to 12 hours? Mm-hmm. Was it more expensive to sell to the doctors? I guess money is always behind
it wasn't more expensive to the doctors. One of the things they did is they hired 5,000 physicians, nurses, and pharmacists to become paid spokesmen for the drug. So they would send doctors on free trips to Florida and Arizona and these kind of pain management seminars, and then they would go back to their communities and spread the gospel about OxyContin. They gave them, I mean, Dr. Art Van Zee talks about doctors being given OxyContin branded beach hats. At the time, children in his practice were dying of overdose from the drug. I mean, just completely insensitive. And they just wrote him off like a kook. And these other doctors allowed themselves to be basically bought off, paid off.
And then Purdue fought this, and like you said, eventually they came up with the addiction resistant. But how do you make it addiction resistant?
Abuse resistant.
Abuse resistant.
Yeah. So they made it. What the users told me is they changed the coding so it would gel up. You couldn't squish it into a powder anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And sort of when that happened, then doctors stopped prescribing as much, and then the cartel drug leaders started sending in heroin, knowing that was a cheaper way to stave off dope sickness. It was a hell of a business model, right? You already had all these people, this addiction seeded for you with OxyContin and other opioid pills. And it wasn't just Purdue Pharma, but they were the leader. They were very much the leaders.
So it's kind of like as the OxyContin was dying down or being checked, held in balance, the baton was handed to heroin. And that became the new.
Right, and then around 2015, fentanyl started being imported, largely over the dark web, and dealers would cut their heroin with fentanyl, which of course is much, much stronger than even heroin. And if you get too much fentanyl in your heroin, you can die really easily.
So, Tim, when you had your eye injury last week, they gave you fentanyl?
They did.
Yeah.
So why, Beth, would they give him fentanyl as the first course when it's so dang powerful?
Well, prescription fentanyl is different than this fake fentanyl coming in from China. I had outpatient surgery last year myself, and the first words I heard when I woke up in the recovery room was such and such fentanyl. So I was given fentanyl too. It's a very common surgical procedure. Drug, totally safe if used in the hospital, right? But we shouldn't be giving fentanyl and OxyContin for moderate pain, take home kind of thing. I mean, that's been proven to be disastrous to this country.
And Beth, you've lived here, I think, since '89. I've lived here since '86 in Roanoke. I think G's been here forever. How has this impacted Roanoke? Because in your book, woven in there are things that areas that we know, Cave Spring, Mid Valley, Towers. How has it affected Roanoke?
Well, it's affected Roanoke hard. I mean, we have one of the highest hepatitis C rates in the state. That's because of users sharing needles. We have one of the highest rates of NAS babies delivered at Carilion. That's neonatal abstinence syndrome. So those are dependent babies born dependent on opioids their mothers were using. We have among the highest overdose death rates. When the fentanyl spike happened in Roanoke, I believe it was June of 2015, we had the highest ER, we had the most number of ER calls that month in Virginia. So Roanoke's an interesting place because it's sort of not quite Appalachia, but it's a place where you get people with Appalachian roots, and it's kind of the place where all kinds of people meet, and it's near 81. A lot of the drugs come in on 81, and as one of the people in the book says, it's where all the stories meet, so you had these wealthier kids were able to hide their addictions longer because they could say, oh, Mom, I lost my iPad, or my iPad was stolen, not I pawned it at the pawn shop to get drug money. And they had the money to hide. And of course, cell phones made it easy to hide what they were doing. Right. And the parents who were in on the dirty little secret, in quotes, were too ashamed that they would be judged, afraid they'd be judged, to tell the neighbors. So this really hit the news big in like 2010 when that very well-known civic leader's son was sentenced to prison, Spencer Mulpower, for the death of a classmate.
I had an uncle recently that passed away, 67. So cleaning out his apartment, there were bench spoons, there were needles,
Wow.
and it was very, it's very embarrassing for the family. I was asked to go help with this, so my cousin wouldn't see what her father was doing. And as I began to research that, just look into that, I didn't even know what a bench spoon was. And so I was researching that, and I won't say his name, but my uncle had hepatitis C years ago.
Did he get started on OxyContin? Do you think?
I'm not sure, Beth. I didn't ask my aunts too much about it because they really, they were embarrassed, like you said. And I began to think, was the hepatitis C all those years ago due to this? And eventually, all these years later, it finally came to a head.
Is that what he died of?
4 o'clock in the morning, absolutely.
Complications of hep?
Yes.
Yeah. And they say hepatitis C is just going to be a tsunami in this
Let
country.
me back that up, Beth. No. He apparently got cured from that
Okay.
years ago. He died of an overdose.
Of heroin?
Yeah.
67 years old.
67.
Just not what you would think of, is it?
You would never think that.
Let me
But I bet you anything, he got started on opioid pills.
Oh, I've got no doubt about that. I had another uncle who
What did he
was
do for a living?
a handyman. He
Yeah.
used to work for the railroad, and you piece it together. When he got hurt on the railroad, he got prescribed painkillers probably 30-some years ago. And so his brother also was disabled and on painkillers. And it ended up being a strain of the relationship because my uncle that passed away was taking his brother's pills that he really did need and wasn't abusing those. So it was just an amazing web of
Yeah.
complexities.
And very, very common story.
Now, overdoses, deaths by overdoses, Beth, 50 years and younger. Is that the
Leading cause of death for people 50 and under. We have the equivalent, they say it's the equivalent of a 9/11 every 3 weeks in this country. I mean, think about how much attention 9/11 got.
right?
And
Was there a reason why you chose this subject? Was it anything to do, was it personal with you like it was with me? Did you know anyone?
not really. I had written this 3-part series in 2012 following Spencer and the mother of the child who died, that Spencer was being prosecuted for contributing to his death. I followed these two families in 2012, and we ran this 3-part series on the front page of the Roanoke Times, and I remember people were like, holy crap, wealthy white people do heroin? And, we thought that would be a wake-up call. We hoped at least people would go to their medicine cabinet and rid everything that was an opioid. They have these drug take-back days, and they collect quite a few pills, but it's not enough. I think the pharmacies are starting to take them back, year-round now. But that's the simplest thing we could all do. And then we could all just be better consumers of our own health care. When I mentioned that surgery I had last year, they gave me 15 oxycodone. And then they gave me a prescription, I can't remember, it was ibuprofen or, like an NSAID. And I took 2 of the oxycodone. It made me feel really weird. And then I went to the ibuprofen, and I was fine. I think
Yeah, I
we
did
just
the
in
same
this
thing.
country, we've gotten so used to, gotta fix it with the pill, gotta fix it with the pill.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in your book that with that pain scale 0 to 10, people will say, "Well, how do I get to 0?"
Yeah.
But you can function at 3 or 4 certainly very effectively.
Yeah. And some people, depending on what you're used to, it's in European countries they just don't do that, and they don't have the problem at the scale that we have.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I had my surgery, the same thing. I got a prescription for the oxycodone, and I just didn't. I was scared to take it.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel it was all that necessary.
And how did you know to be scared? Do you remember how you knew?
I think there was another drug that's kind of confused. It's either oxycodone or oxycodone. One of those two was just in the headlines. It was,
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm kind of like you. I just didn't feel like I really needed it. I had hernia surgery, and it hurt like hell. But you just rest and you take some extra strength Tylenol, and in a few days you're better.
Yeah. It's not fun. You just gotta power through.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Right. So where do we go from here, Beth? I guess from when it all started in '96 in rural areas, stretching from Lee County to Maine, has there been any Chernobyl effect? I mean, is there any lingering effects with families or people in those areas?
Oh yeah. I mean, these communities are destroyed. If you go to the coal fields, I mean, it isn't just the coal mines shut down and furniture factories closed. There are also areas that have the highest opioid prescribing rates, and they've got huge drug problems. I was in Harlan County, Kentucky a couple weeks ago doing some reporting, and I interviewed a public defender, and she said, we've lost so many people, we're thinking about putting up a memorial wall.
It's incredible.
So it's still an issue.
Still an issue. We've got 2.6 million people with opioid use disorder. We got to get them help.
And it's not like you can come up with like a vaccine for smallpox and take care of everything. So is it a layered, multifaceted approach, or what do you recommend?
Science says the best treatment for preventing overdose deaths is medication-assisted treatment, and that's buprenorphine or methadone. You may have heard of methadone before. Methadone is dispensed like in a daily clinic. Buprenorphine is take-home. And when it's done properly, it reduces overdose deaths by 50 to 60%. They recommend counseling with it too, but some people think you don't even need counseling. Let's just get everybody that has opioid use disorder this buprenorphine. And that'll cut overdose death rates. Dr. Van Zie's been prescribing it since 2003. It came out in 2002. So he's been in the trenches with this for a long time. He now has patients getting their children back, getting their jobs back, going back to school. They've been on it for years. And he says some people he has down to 0.5 milligram, and yet he's still afraid to take them off because science isn't a for sure thing. It evolves. And some people think it should be like insulin. You're on it for the rest of your life. But what it does is it blocks cravings. It's an opioid itself. It doesn't get you high if taken correctly, but it blocks those cravings, and that allows people to get kind of their life back together. And
but that's not done across the board.
now, a lot of the abstinence-only programs, NA and AA, are largely against it, largely against medication-assisted treatment because they think it's treating an opioid with another opioid.
Right.
So we need more nuance all around.
Yeah, it's just time to change that mentality. After such an epidemic, would you think?
It is, and we can't, this epidemic is such a large scale, 2.6 million people. A lot of people say, well, we need to build more rehabs. Yeah, maybe we need to build more rehabs, but what we really need to do, would be so much easier and more costly, is to develop everywhere this kind of easy access system of what my dear Tess, who dies at the end of the book, said, one of the first interviews I had with her, she had gotten addicted at an urgent care. She said, what we really need is an urgent care for the addicted. So what that could look like, and I've been to communities that have syringe exchange and recovery programs. It could be a place where somebody goes in, they exchange their dirty needles for clean ones until they're ready to get help. And then when they're ready to get help, meanwhile, you're staving off the spread of disease, hepatitis C and HIV. And then when they're ready to get help, that can be a place they go to where they get referral to MAT. So that's really simple. It would be kind of the low-hanging fruit in this. Simple, expensive, but not as expensive as building a huge web of rehabs everywhere. And then most of the rehabs we have in this country don't allow you to be on MAT. So we need some federal guidance here. We really do.
Okay. And then within Roanoke and Roanoke County, are our resources reasonably adequate, or do we need?
They're terrible.
Terrible. Okay.
They're terrible. So there's a 3-week wait to get into a buprenorphine program at Carilion.
Okay.
Virginia recently approved syringe exchange, but the police chief here has come out against it. So that it's kind of mired in bureaucracy and politics right now. I had an event yesterday at the Taubman Museum, my book opening, and I said this out loud at this forum. And I had 4 city council members there, and a couple of them came up to me after and said, they said, we're going to fix this. And I really hope so. I think Chief Jones just hasn't been seen what a well-run syringe exchange and recovery program could look like. But I had a friend tell me the other day that she knew of a little kid that was playing in Garsh Mill Park, stepped on a dirty needle in the creek, and then had to have a whole year of hepatitis C testing. He's okay, thank God. I have a friend who lives in Southeast. Her kids take the alley behind their house to get to school. 3 heroin needles the other day.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the chief, you know, it's not so much changing your mind as growth, you know, and he just doesn't have the information yet, you know?
Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't.
Yeah.
Is it likely, Beth, that you, well, I know you do, and you do, but that most of us here in Roanoke know somebody that's been touched by this addiction?
They say more than 50% of Americans now know somebody either in their family or knows a friend who's been touched by this. And so I wrote this book, you know, kind of soup to nuts as far as I could take it. Of course, it's a moving target. New studies came out even since I finished the book, and I'll try to update that in the paperback next year. But I wanted this to be a book you could give your mom and she would understand, or any of us, we would understand how it is we got to this place and what it's going to do to get us out of it.
Right.
So my publisher says it's the only book to fully chart the opioid crisis. I don't know if that's quite true. It's a nice thing to say, but I really do think you understand how we got here, how it spread from the rural hinterlands to the cities and suburbs, and then more recently to idyllic farm towns like Woodstock.
How big of a problem is it in high schools?
Well, they talk about farm parties, PHARM, pills being passed around in bowls. A lot of kids start out with kids who are taking Ritalin, which a lot of people believe is ADHD is overdiagnosed. By the time they get to high school, kids are partying. They're sharing pills that they've taken from their parents or grandparents' medicine. A lot of the boy in the beginning of the book, Jesse, he starts out trading his ADHD medicine for opioids after he gets addicted from a snowboarding or football injury. His mother can't remember which. There were so many injuries because he was a big sports guy. And but those ADHD meds came in handy. And if you look at the data, 2/3 of college seniors have been offered an illicit pill, a pill not prescribed to them. 2/3. My son, I told my son that he was going to Wake Forest at the time. He's now at JMU. He's like, "Oh, Mom, you have no idea. The ADHD meds, some kids taking them all night to study. Yeah, but they're also taking them all night to stay up drinking." Mm-hmm. And it's off the hook.
I've asked my daughter about that too. You know, you can't help but just read about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, just passively, you know, Hannah, have you heard of this? And she's like, yeah, I've heard of it, you know, and it's just pervasive.
Yeah.
Well, as we get ready to wrap up, Beth, two questions. This sequence of events, could it ever happen again, do you think? And two, tell us a little bit about the photographs that Josh came up with.
Oh, sure. It could absolutely happen again. It happened after the Civil War. I have one chapter called The United States of Amnesia. It's like we forgot, right? It could absolutely happen again, especially when unchecked commerce is allowed to put this drug and falsely claim it's not addictive, all for the mighty dollar. And then the photos were taken by my dear colleague and friend Josh Meltzer, who used to work at the Roanoke Times with me. We did many projects together. We did refugees, immigration, caregiving for the elderly. We did a lot of projects together, and we really work well.
I'll give you the last word. How do people find out more about Dopesick, and are you going to be appearing anywhere else?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So everything's on my website, author.bethmacy.com. If you click on book events, all my events here. I'm going to be at Barnes & Noble this Friday. I'm not sure when this is airing. I'll be at St. John's Episcopal Church coming up.
Check the website.
Check the website. And September 26th is going to be a really special event at Virginia Western, where we're going to have not just a presentation by me about the book, but also the community's going to announce like a response to the book and some initiatives that are starting to happen that are partly inspired by the book, and that's really exciting to me.
Yeah.
So that'll be cool. That should hopefully be in the news a little bit at the time, so people can stay alert for that.
Well, you're such a gladiator for the cause. We're so proud to have you. So proud to have
Thanks,
you.
buddy.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you were terrific. Thanks.